Before we take our look at the Daleks Master Plan, it would be a glaring omission to not first examine the single episode teaser for that story, Mission to the Unknown, or as you might know it if you're anally retentive, Dalek Cutaway. The genesis of this episode is reasonably well known, but I'll repeat it for those unaware. At the beginning of the second season, Planet of Giants was edited down from 3 episodes to 4 in order to improve its pace, leaving an episode gap in Doctor Who's schedule. An extra episode therefore needs to be made to fill that gap. Instead of just bumping up a 4-part to the 5 or something like that, they decided to make a single episode to set up a 12-part epic that would be coming along shortly. Now, frankly, I had to question why they thought this was necessary or desirable for a number of reasons. It's not as if Daleks Master Plan was going to be in desperate need of every second of its runtime, being the best part of 5 hours long and all that, so it's stuff that could have been quite easily set up there. Also, telling a whole story in 25 minutes was going to be extremely difficult, as New Who frequently struggles with double that length. It would just mean there wouldn't be enough time to set up engaging characters and an intriguing plot. The fact that it has to be a setup for another bigger story means it would be unlikely to have a satisfactory conclusion as well. However, while Mission does struggle with these issues, I think it nevertheless does an okay job considering what it is and what it needed to be. It's a curious experiment and one that I'm glad was not repeated, but also one that has merits that can be appreciated. Now, Mission is of course missing from the BBC archives. No footage at all survives from it, and as most of Season 3 was not telesnapped, there's no still visual record either. The only part of the original broadcast that survives is the soundtrack. Through use of set pictures and composites, Loose Cannon have created a reconstruction up to their usual standards, and this feels like less of an issue than it does with Master Plan, simply because it's only 25 minutes long. The rather limited nature of the story, there's only really 2 sets and fairly limited action, do also contribute to that. Mission is also notable as one of only 2 stories broadcast once and never sold out the UK, the other being Master Plan, but there are 2 curiosities here. Firstly, because Master Plan has 3 existing episodes that have been watched outside the UK, Mission is the only story ever to have been watched by a British audience only. Secondly, that might not actually be true. In Singapore, there is one more confirmed air date than episodes of Doctor Who actually bought, and there's no evidence to the contrary that this episode was bought and screened in Singapore. However, there's no actual evidence in support of it either, and given that Singapore's list of air dates is basically just guesswork because of lack of evidence, never mind that there's a bit odd the one episode that's screened without evidence for having done so is the extremely odd single-parter, it was probably just actually Doctor Who being replaced at the last minute or something. In any case, even if it did, it's not as if the film print survives today, so it's a pretty academic discussion really. Just thought it worth discussing, as I'll be looking more into the circumstances surrounding these stories' archive status in the Master Plan video, and, well, it's not as if there's a great deal else to talk about, let's be honest. Mission is of course also notable for being the only Doctor Who story not to feature the Doctor or his companions, instead focusing on another popular element of the show, the Daleks, and using that as a basis. Instead of a Doctor, the primary character of the piece is Space Security Service agent Marc Cory, licensed to kill. Which, if that sounds familiar from somewhere, Mission, and to a lesser extent Master Plan, focuses on one of the most important cultural crazes of the mid-60s, spies. When James Bond over-enthusiastically leaped onto the movie screens 3 years earlier, it had started the public fascination with spies and secret agents, no doubt enhanced by the Cold War paranoia of the time. The 4th Bond film Thunderball entered cinemas in December 1965, while the Daleks Master Plan was being broadcast, and to this day it remains the most financially successful Bond film adjusting for inflation. So Doctor Who using this craze as an inspiration was fairly inevitable, and as this is something I didn't have time to talk about in the Master Plan review, it is something I do wish they'd used a bit more in that story actually, as I just think it works quite well. As for how Mission uses this element, it is definitely hampered by the limitations of its length and nature as a one-off episode. We learn precious little about Cory's mission and the nature of the organisation of which he is part. We're just told it's spies in space, and it's all told in exposition anyway. Now, perhaps there is actually a great deal of impressive visual storytelling that we of course can't see due to the complex relationship between film print and flamethrower, but I'm going to guess probably not. But again, it is a limitation of the fact that it is trying to pack plot, character, atmosphere, all of that in 25 minutes. There simply isn't time to develop the wider universe regarding Cory's spying stuff. Now, it's a fault of Master Plan which did have the time to develop this and still didn't really manage it, but, Master Planner will have its own issues, we'll get to that. I trust the logic there makes sense. Anyway, the character of Cory himself is nevertheless a strength for the piece, as he's pretty much the only character for a start, but also because in a way the episode itself is about him. Now, in 25 minutes he doesn't really go through much of an arc, but we do learn about his motivations and ideals. Basically that he's a bit of a hard-ass, someone motivated by duty enough to gun down 2 of his comrades without a moment's hesitation, but the way in which he gives his life similarly without any hesitation to try and warn the Earth about the Daleks shows the positives of such a motivation. Also, while we're not really supposed to think Cory is in the right shooting the other two, the fact they were being mutated into killer plants, essentially a fate worse than death, means we understand why he's doing it. But the fact he remains so dispassionate while doing it means we never stray into thinking he's a good person or a hero. There's layers to him that I like, and this is further enhanced in how the long exposition-y bit where he explains the plot to the other bloke is used partially as a means of explaining the plot, but also as a means of showing Cory's feelings towards the other bloke. Barely disguised irritation bordering on resentment, but also as a fellow Earthman, someone he does think worth his help. I'm not sure I could watch a series about Cory, hell, probably not even a full story without a doctor, but given this is the Marc Cory show for 25 minutes, I think the character has enough to make him work. He's also portrayed quite well by Edward the Souza, and it is quite funny, but the cultural impact of Doctor Who means that a 25-minute part he did 60 years ago is still one that he's strongly associated with, to the point where he did the intro to the remake of this episode they made a few years ago. The Souza does quite a good job of making Cory feel icy and attached without this turning him into a complete prick, so he's walking a fine line quite effectively. As for everyone else, other humans 1 and 2 don't really have anything to do, they're just there to exposit and or die. I'd maybe have liked the guy Cory exposits to maybe have a bit more to him, insofar as he has a character as he grumbles and complains. And there's nothing really much more to him, but hey, such a limited time, focusing on one character is probably a smarter move. As for the other stuff, well, the design of many of the aliens, most of which would be reused in Master Plan, are very creative and quite well done. They look like they come from a low-budget 60s sci-fi show, of course, but given that's what they are, I think they work well, and they're certainly memorable. I mean, look at this guy. I suppose we've all felt like that sometimes. Of course, we're only really going on the production stills for this episode, so there's no real awareness of knowing how effective it was in the flesh this time around, but given we do see most of it in episode 2 of Master Plan and they look decent here, it's a reasonable assumption. And when it comes to the rest of the production, well, we don't know, do we? That's the problem we're talking about in the missing episodes. Much of what is actually important to talk about with a television production is gone, so it does rather reduce the available discussion topics. So, there are some decent music cues. Alright, I'll wrap this up, and I'm going to wrap this up with a bit of a cop-out. I'm not going to give this one a final score. The point is to measure it up against the rest of Classic Who, but this episode is so far from what you'd expect from Classic Who that comparing it seems pointless. Hell, take out the Daleks and there's pretty much nothing that would even be remotely connecting it to Who, so I think trying to place this amongst the rest of Classic Who would be fruitless. That doesn't mean I think it's bad though. For what it is, a short 25-minute teaser for the epic to come, it works decently enough, and with a central lead given a small but interesting bit of character, it's paced reasonably well despite its length. So take it for what it's worth. And as for the Daleks themselves, well, come back tomorrow for the review of the Daleks Master Plan.